Deep in the Bavarian wilderness of 1922, where ancient forests cast long shadows across frost-covered fields, the Gruber family farm stood as a lonely sentinel against the gathering darkness. The locals called it Hinterkaifeck, the place behind Kaifeck, though soon it would be known by another name, the Farm of Horrors. Andreas Gruber, a weathered 63-year-old farmer with eyes as hard as winter frost, traced the footprints in the newly fallen snow. They led from the edge of the dark forest straight to his farmhouse, but there were no prints leading back. His calloused fingers tightened around his walking stick as he followed their path to the machine shed. The door was locked, just as he'd left it, yet something felt wrong. His daughter Victoria, a striking woman of 35 with haunted eyes that spoke of past troubles, watched from the kitchen window. "Father," she called out, her voice carrying across the frozen yard. "Come inside. It's getting dark." Andreas cast one last look at the tree line before trudging back to the warmth of the house. Inside, his wife Cecilia stirred a pot of soup, her movements mechanical, her face lined with worry. Their granddaughter Cecilia, just 7 years old, sat at the wooden table, her legs swinging freely as she watched her 2-year-old brother Joseph play with wooden blocks on the floor. "More strange happenings?" Cecilia asked her husband, though she already knew the answer. For months now, inexplicable events had plagued their isolated farm. Keys disappeared, tools moved on their own. And always, there were the sounds. Footsteps in the attic when everyone was accounted for, whispers in the night that shouldn't be there. Andreas grunted, unwilling to admit his growing unease. Someone's been walking around the property again. But the snow. He trailed off, not wanting to voice the impossible fact that the footprints had no return path. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the farm, the new maid Maria Baumgartner arrived. She was a sturdy woman in her mid-40s, recommended by the church in a nearby village. Their previous maid had fled 6 months earlier, claiming to hear voices in the night and feeling a constant oppressive presence in the house. "Welcome to Hinterkaifeck," Victoria said, helping Maria with her bags. "I hope you'll be comfortable here." She didn't mention how the last 6 maids had all left within weeks, each more terrified than the last. As Maria settled into her room, Andreas sat in his study, poring over recent editions of the local newspaper. Strange articles had caught his eye, reports of vagrants in the area, of items gone missing from farms, of lights seen in the forests at night. He'd dismissed them at first, but now, the sound of something heavy dragging across the attic floor made him freeze. Above him, dust drifted down from the ceiling boards. Footsteps, clear and deliberate, crossed from one end of the attic to the other. "Victoria," he called out, knowing full well his daughter was downstairs helping her mother with dinner. The footsteps stopped. That night, as the family gathered around the dinner table, young Cecilia spoke up. "Grandfather, who was the man in the forest today?" The adults exchanged quick glances. "What man, Liebchen?" Victoria asked, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for her water glass. "The one watching us from between the trees. He's been there for days now. Sometimes he waves to me." Andreas pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "I'm checking the property before dark. Victoria, make sure all the doors are locked tonight." But no amount of searching revealed any stranger on their land. As Andreas made his final round, checking the locks on the barn and machine shed, he couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching him from the darkness. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The next few days passed in a haze of mounting tension. Maria quickly noticed the strange atmosphere in the house, the way the family started at unexpected sounds, how they huddled together in the evenings, how young Cecilia would sometimes stare at empty corners and wave to someone who wasn't there. On March 31st, 1922, Andreas made a disturbing discovery that he shared with his neighbor. He'd found newspaper pages in the attic, despite never bringing them up there. Someone had been living above them, reading their papers, watching them through the floorboards. The neighbor urged him to contact the police, but Andreas, proud and stubborn, insisted on handling it himself. That evening, as darkness fell over Hinterkaifeck for the last time, the Gruber family sat down to their final meal together. Maria, having just completed her first day of work, joined them at the table. None of them knew that eyes were watching them through the windows, that their every movement was being observed by someone who had waited patiently, learning their routines, choosing the perfect moment. The murders began in the barn. Andreas Gruber was the first to die, lured out by a noise in the evening darkness. Victoria followed shortly after, worried about her father's lengthy absence. Young Cecilia, perhaps hearing her mother's screams, ran toward the barn. One by one, they fell to the brutal strikes of a mattock, their bodies arranged with a chilling deliberateness in the hay. Inside the house, Cecilia Sr. stirred from her chair, wondering about the silence from the barn. She never saw the figure that stepped from the shadows behind her. 2-year-old Joseph, sleeping peacefully in his crib, and Maria Baumgartner, the unfortunate new maid who had arrived at exactly the wrong time, were the last to die. But the horror of Hinterkaifeck was only beginning. For 4 days after the murders, neighbors noticed smoke rising from the farmhouse chimney. The cattle were fed and milked. Someone was living there, going about the daily chores, sleeping in the beds of the dead, as 6 bodies lay cooling in the barn. When the bodies were finally discovered on April 4th, the killer was long gone. The police investigation that followed revealed disturbing details. The murders had been methodically planned, the killer likely living in the attic for weeks or even months before striking. Money was left untouched in the house, ruling out robbery as a motive. The murder weapon, the blood-stained mattock, was found propped against a wall, as if displayed. Most chilling of all were the signs that the killer had made themselves at home after the murders. Dishes in the sink, recently cooked meals, beds that had been slept in. They had lived among the dead, comfortable in the house of horrors they had created. The case would never be solved. Dozens of suspects were questioned, from disgruntled farmhands to traveling craftsmen, but no one was ever charged. The killer's identity remained as mysterious as their motive, leaving behind only questions and a legacy of terror that would haunt Bavaria for generations. The Hinterkaifeck farmhouse was eventually demolished, the land plowed under in an attempt to erase the horror that had occurred there. But even today, locals speak in hushed tones about the murders, about the footprints that led nowhere, about the mysterious figure in the forest who watched and waited. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees where the farm once stood, some say you can still hear footsteps in the darkness, footsteps that, like those in the snow so many years ago, lead somewhere but never lead back. In the end, the true horror of Hinterkaifeck lies not just in the brutality of the murders, but in the patient malevolence behind them. Someone had watched this family, lived above them, learned their routines, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. They had turned the family's own home into a trap, their familiar surroundings into a killing ground. The case remains one of history's most disturbing unsolved murders, a dark reminder that sometimes the greatest threats are the ones we don't see, the eyes watching from the darkness, the footsteps in the attic, the stranger who comes to stay and never leaves. And perhaps most terrifying of all is the question that haunts everyone who studies the case. How long had the killer really been there, watching, waiting, before anyone noticed? How many nights had the Gruber family sat down to dinner, unaware that death itself was living in their attic, reading their newspapers, and biding its time? Some mysteries are better left unsolved, the locals say. But the mystery of Hinterkaifeck continues to captivate and horrify, a testament to the darkness that can lurk in the most ordinary places, waiting for the perfect moment to emerge from the shadows and make itself known. The farm is gone now, but its story lives on, A warning to those who think they're alone in their homes at night, when the wind howls and floorboards creak, and footsteps echo from rooms that should be empty. For in the end, the most terrifying truth about Hinterkaifeck might be this. Somewhere out there, the killer or their descendants still live, carrying with them the secret of what really happened on that cold March night in 1922, when death came to stay at a lonely farm in Bavaria.